G'day, I'm Rowan Mackey and welcome to Individuate, the podcast where we use the vehicle of starting our own podcast to try and get the best out of ourselves in the service of others. Today, we've got a bit of a different episode altogether again. To be completely honest with you, I had scheduled an interview with someone and there was a slight miscommunication around timing, so we'll be bringing that to you very soon. But in not having a particular episode scheduled for today, it gives me a bit of an opportunity to have a spare slot in the schedule to discuss whatever I want to. That's part of the beauty of podcasts. I can explore whatever ideas I want to. Obviously recognizing that you're coming along for the ride too, so it's not all about me. But there's been something on my mind a fair bit recently that I'm going to indulge in exploring today. So for today's episode, I'll be sharing with you some insight into my greatest passion in life, sport. Because something has happened recently in the world of sport, arguably the biggest event in terms of the administration of sport in my lifetime. But a bit more on exactly what that is a little later on. As we've discussed briefly on previous episodes, part of what I want to do with this podcast is to separate the concept of individuation from individualism. And so, although I was initially hesitant to focus on something negative, I think it's important to look at why it's not good to be individualistic. What are the actual implications? It's one thing to say something's bad, but I want to get my head around why. Because arguments are regularly made for individualistic thinking, and I don't want to just dismiss it without exploring exactly why it should be de-emphasized. So that's what we're going to do today, to start to build a model of what individualism is and why it's not good. But we don't want to focus too much on the negative, so I'll be talking about it in the context of what I consider to be the most overwhelmingly positive thing in the world, sport. Plus, at the end of today's episode, I've got a little theory that I've been thinking about for a long time, but I haven't really put it out there before, so I'm excited to bring it to you. But before we get to that, I want to tell you how the individualism of a football manager started the chain reaction that caused the biggest sporting team in the world to fall into disarray. Sir Alex Ferguson is arguably the greatest football manager of all time. He has won more trophies than any other manager in the history of professional football, and he sat at the helm of Manchester United, the biggest club in the world, for almost 27 years. An absolutely incredible feat, highlighted by the fact that Manchester United are up to their 5th manager in the 8 years since Ferguson retired. But a little known fact about the great manager is that it can be argued that his individualism was the catalyst for the current predicament Manchester United find themselves in. Last weekend, Manchester United's game against arch-rivals Liverpool had to be postponed after protesting fans breached the biosecurity bubble and entered the playing surface at Old Trafford, Manchester United's hallowed stadium. The protest shocked the football world. These were scenes that we haven't seen for a long time in English football. But if you track Manchester United's demise, which took them from being the undisputed biggest sporting team in the world in 2012, to now, according to Forbes, sitting 10th in 2020. It can be argued that you can trace it back to the actions of their greatest ever manager, Sir Alex Ferguson. According to a great number of Manchester United fans, their problems are the direct result of the management of the current ownership, the American Glazer family. And I definitely don't want to absolve them, because they'll come up a little later in today's podcast. But what I want to focus on here is just how Manchester United came to be in the hands of the Glazer family. The story starts in 2001. Then manager of United, Sir Alex Ferguson, was a renowned horse racing lover and regularly attended the races with majority owners of Manchester United, Irish horse racing tycoons John Magnier and J.P. McManus. Around this time, the three friends had a conversation. The result of this conversation was that Sir Alex was led to believe that he was the half owner of a horse, Rock of Gibraltar, an ownership he shared with Magnier's wife. The horse even raced in Manchester United's famous red colours. The racing tycoon's offer of ownership proved to be incredibly generous, as Rock of Gibraltar turned out to be an absolute world beater. I won't get into the details of it, because as those who know me know, this could fast turn into a horse racing podcast if I'm not careful. But after winning a record number of Group 1 races, the most elite class of horse racing there is, Rock of Gibraltar was named the European Horse of the Year and had won over £1.2 million in prize money. This seemed like great news for everyone concerned, but unfortunately, This is where the trouble started. Those who are into horse racing will know that the money a horse earns on the track is one thing, but the real money to be made in horses is through sending that horse to stud. This is where a horse is retired to become a breeder, and a horse with Rock of Gibraltar's resume could charge nearly $1 million for a rendezvous. So, at this time, when he was European Horse of the Year, Rock of Gibraltar was worth over £50 million. So, as many owners do in this situation, Sir Alex tried to cash in his stake. This presented a problem, however, as according to Magnier and McManus, Sir Alex didn't own half the horse. He was only entitled to half the prize money. This made Sir Alex furious. He was rarely, if ever, told no by anyone, including the owners of his club. And so he pursued the ownership of the horse right the way up to the Irish High Court. Now this presented a pretty awkward situation. Magnier and McManus were the majority shareholders at Manchester United. This was the owners of the club and the manager of the club involved in a legal dispute against each other worth potentially tens of millions of pounds. It's hard to think of an Australian equivalent because we don't have sporting ownership in this country, but it would almost be like if Eddie Maguire and Nathan Buckley were in court over a legal dispute worth millions of dollars. How is that not supposed to affect anything at Collingwood? For my American listeners, it would be a bit like Robert Kraft and Bill Belichick being in court. Not a good recipe for success. But for Manchester United, things got so bad that Roy Keane, a stalwart of the club, had to confront his manager about the whole affair. Talking about the confrontation in his autobiography, Keane said, "And I told him that I didn't think it was good for the club, for the manager in a legal dispute with shareholders. I felt I was entitled to say that. He was just a mascot for them, walking around with this Rock of Gibraltar. Look at me, how big I am. And he didn't even own the bloody thing." Although the matter was settled out of court, with both parties agreeing to never speak about the financial arrangements, it seems the damage to the relationship was done. And knowing that they would cause anarchy if they were to remove Ferguson from his post as manager of United, when they were made an offer for their stake in the club by the Glazer family, they quickly accepted, completing a takeover worth more than £800 million. Literally from the moment the Glazers stepped in the door at Manchester United, they've drawn the ire of a large number of United's fans. The finances surrounding the takeover were such that they leveraged the club for their own personal gain, placing Manchester United into debt for the first time since 1931. As of halfway through last year, Manchester United's debt stood at £531 million. But this is before the consequences of the pandemic have been fully felt. This is despite the Glazer family themselves making over £200 million in dividends and interest since they first took over Manchester United in 2005. Now, the Glazers would probably have a different argument to the fans. They would argue that they've made money available for transfers, but we're talking about a relatively small percentage of the gross profit a club that size makes. And although they're second in the Premier League this year, they're an absolute shadow of the club that they used to be. Speaking to football publication Goal, football finance expert Kieran Maguire said of the initial conversation between Ferguson, Magnier and McManus, where Ferguson thought he was promised ownership of Rock of Gibraltar, "I think if that particular discussion over the horse had never taken place, we could be watching a very different Manchester United today." So it seems to me that had Alex Ferguson not been so individualistic about the ownership of a single racehorse, then Manchester United might not be in the situation they find themselves in today. Now, I admit I have a bit of an ulterior motive talking about individualism in the context of the Glazer family and Manchester United, because although I'm a Newcastle United fan, and Sir Alex once referred to Newcastle United as just a wee club from the northeast, if there's anything I've wanted to discuss lately, it's the creation of the European Super League. And I think there's a point to be made about individualism that the attempted formation of the Super League illustrates. Now, I'm aware that not all of you are sports fans, and so I'll keep the technical analysis brief. But essentially the Super League was a plan to create a breakaway competition for Europe's biggest football clubs. Firstly, and I'll explain why in a moment, but it was literally the biggest act of hubris I've ever seen by anyone in my lifetime. How these ultra-capitalists thought that it would be a good idea in the first place is a podcast in itself. But to explain it briefly, the Super League consisted of a 20-team league, with 15 of those spots being guaranteed each year. The other 5 of those spots would be made up of the highest performing teams outside of that existing 15. As Florentino Perez, president of Real Madrid and man spearheading the Super League, said, "We have to agree to a new European Super League which guarantees that the best always play the best, something which doesn't always happen in the Champions League. This therefore means more games against high caliber European opponents." For these big clubs, this was an exciting prospect. Due to the pandemic, where they had seen seasons shorted and fans kept out of matches to this day, the hit to the pocket of these clubs, like almost everyone in society, has been huge. Real Madrid and Barcelona, the 2 biggest clubs in the world currently, are both in over €1 billion of debt. And so the clubs involved wanted a new earning arrangement that could see them financially profitable again in the near future. The American bank JP Morgan even put up over €3.2 billion to fund the Super League, so it was financially a very appealing prospect. However, one of the major issues with this arrangement is that the 15 teams perpetually in the Super League would receive hundreds of millions of euros a year, but they would be competing against teams who would only be receiving that money when they're in the Super League. Plus, they would be competing against teams who didn't receive a huge initial investment for being a founding member. And with only 5 spots left for the entirety of Europe's other football teams, it left them hardly anything to play for. So as time went on, the wealth, and therefore the best players, and ultimately the success, would have been concentrated towards the existing teams, and then the more rich of those existing teams. Basically, unless you were one of the founding clubs, you were only there in a participatory capacity, with no real chance of winning. Now, I know there's people who consider sport to be just entertainment, and I'll explain why I disagree with that shortly. But this hits at the heart of what sport is. It would take away the essential element of competition, because you wouldn't incentivise the good performance of the teams outside the Super League, and you wouldn't disincentivise the poor performance for the teams within it. Currently, football in Europe is set up in what's called a pyramid system. This means that through the top teams from each league being promoted to the division above, and the poorest performing teams dropping back to the league below, technically any club in Europe can get to the top. This is the way that football's set up, and any sense of hope for any real success for those teams outside of the top few would vanish. And as a Newcastle United supporter, I've had literal dreams about Newcastle playing in Europe again, and that would be essentially taken away. Another issue was that the teams chosen weren't even chosen based on results or on-field performance. Everything else was considered secondary compared to the current size of the fan base. Now this, as I'm sure you can gather, was so that the clubs involved would bring the most fans, therefore the most money to the owners. This group of people who wanted to start this breakaway competition even referred to the existing fans of the clubs involved as legacy fans, implying they had created a legacy that was to be passed on to a newer, more commercially appealing fan base. Even Manchester City manager Pep Guardiola, the manager of one of the teams involved in the Super League, shared his disgust about the proposal. It is not a sport where the relation between the effort and the success, the effort and the reward, does not exist. It is not a sport where success is guaranteed, or it is not a sport where it doesn't matter when you lose. Even the players and managers involved didn't want the Super League, but the owners of their clubs signed up anyway, without consulting them. Now, I'm always someone who tries to look at the positive in a situation. So for me, even though a group of less than 10 billionaires tried to destroy the sanctity of competition in football for their own personal gain, what stood out to me about all this was the response to it. Almost literally every fan in the world united against the abhorrent idea of the Super League and the pure commercialisation of sport. In England, players, managers, pundits, fans, administrators of the other clubs, politicians and royalty all came together to denounce the proposal of the Super League. And I don't know of many events in recent history that didn't involve war where so many people came together and united behind an idea, or in this case, against an idea. And I want to unpack a bit of that. Why is it that so many people united against the idea of the European Super League? Because I think there's a principle in there that we can all learn from. Before I do that though, I quickly want to talk about my experience living in England, because it will hopefully help to contextualise some of the feeling involved in this situation. As I said before, I follow Newcastle United. That's because in 2012, I lived in Newcastle upon Tyne, and I was lucky enough to see a fair bit of football at St James's Park. To illustrate the depth of feeling in football in the UK, Newcastle's biggest rival is from a town called Sunderland, situated about 12 miles from Newcastle. The rivalry between Newcastle and Sunderland allegedly stems back to before the English Civil War. In the 1610s, King James I would always award the coal trading rights to Newcastle, not Sunderland. This rendered Sunderland's coal industry useless, and people died as a result of not being able to feed themselves. In 1642, Oliver Cromwell recognised this and chose to garrison a group of Scottish soldiers in Sunderland, thus declaring war with the Royalists from Newcastle. After the resulting Battle of Bolden Hill, Newcastle was captured by the Scottish, and Newcastle's monopoly on the coal trade was broken. In 1660, after the Restoration, Charles II decided to go back to awarding Newcastle the coal rights, and so the rivalry rages on to this day. To try and draw comparisons with Australian or American sport is a complete injustice. The emotion involved in British football goes well beyond just sport. When the Geordies in Newcastle go along to watch their team play, it's not just watching a game, they're able to be part of something that started centuries earlier. Sir Bobby Robson, former Newcastle and Barcelona manager, who grew up in Newcastle, has one of my favourite quotes in the world. I like to think he was particularly thinking of his boyhood club Newcastle when he said this. What is a club, in any case? Not the buildings, or the directors, or the people who are paid to represent it. It's not the television contracts, get-out clauses, marketing departments, or executive boxes. It's the noise, the passion, the feeling of belonging, the pride in your city. It's a small boy clambering up the steps for the very first time, gripping his father's hand, gawping at the hallowed stretch of turf beneath him, and without being able to do a thing, falling in love. I absolutely love that quote, and I think it gets to the heart of all this. It's similar in the town where I grew up, Geelong. The football team, the Geelong Cats, literally dictate the mood of the town. If the Cats win, the place is abuzz. If the Cats lose, it's a bit of a ghost town. The late president of the Cats, Frank Costa, became an incredibly wealthy businessman and started his career selling papers in Geelong. He once said that if the Cats won, he'd double his order, as everyone wanted to read the paper. But if they lost, he'd halve his regular order. Even in the town itself, the stadium that the football team plays in is the most visible landmark. You can see it from almost anywhere in Geelong, and it stands out like a beacon. It reminds me of the way that churches used to be the tallest building in a town, so that everyone was reminded of the transcendent nature of God above them. In Geelong, it's a bit like the football team is that transcendent figure. So I almost joke a bit about the idea that I hate the collection of words, just a game. But I really think that sport is about more than just entertainment. And what the English Super League did, by removing the essential element of competition, was to classify it as strictly entertainment. There primarily for the financial gain of the owners. Now, before tying this all up, now that I've got the opportunity to talk about it, I want to tell you a theory I've got to further demonstrate this idea that sport is more than just about entertainment. Brazil is known for their love of football. They're also known for their flair and the aesthetically pleasing way that Brazilians have traditionally played the game. The reason for this has its roots in the early 16th century, when the Portuguese brought enslaved Africans to Brazil. Many of the slaves escaped their captives and ran away to live in the jungle. To defend themselves, they created capoeira, a martial art based on dance and dynamic movement. One of the movements they created for capoeira was called the ginga, and it forms the foundation for the acrobatic movement that capoeira is based on. When slavery was abolished in Brazil, many of the capoeiristas returned from the jungle, and they found that the capoeira was outlawed all throughout Brazil. They turned to football as a way to practice their ginga movement without being arrested, and the foundations of Brazil's style of football, filled with flair and dynamic movement, was born. So rooted in Brazil's cultural heritage is this ginga style that when Brazil won the World Cup in 1994, the team wasn't held with such high regard as the team that lost in the quarter-final in 1982, because despite losing, they were seen to have played football the right way. In Brazil, they use the phrase joga bonito, which means to play beautifully. It's not enough to win, you have to play the right way. I think that's because their cultural expression is tied to sport. And to varying degrees, I think this is the same all throughout the world. In Australia, for example, our most celebrated teams are the ones who provide the best narrative. We like an underdog story, someone to beat the odds and win against a more fancied, more well-resourced opponent. I think that's partly why all of our sporting competitions in Australia have a grand final. It wouldn't make sense to have a league format because you lose some of the distillation of a narrative that you get with one single game of a grand final. And I think part of this is because of the idea that everyone in Australia connects with story. Indigenous Australians have an oral tradition centred around story. And for those of us whose family came here much later on, there's likely a story in that too. In the UK, however, they celebrate sports and matches in which there's a great tactical contest, vaguely evocative of war. Their biggest sports are rugby union, which is a game that combines brute physical strength with intricate rule technicalities and detailed mental tactics. Football, which is a formation game where you set up your team in a way that's reminiscent of an army approaching battle. And cricket, specifically Test cricket, is set up to be a contest of mental attrition that goes over 5 days. You could argue their affinity with these sports stems from their rich military history. In America, though, it's all about output. Regardless of how you play the game, you're only celebrated if you win. It's about how many rings you've got. I remember listening to a conversation about a basketballer in the NBA in America. And they were talking about someone saying, yeah, he's good. He could have me world class, but he just keeps getting hurt. They would talk derogatorily about the fact that the player got injured. In Australia, it's a sad story when someone gets injured. It's as if it's not their fault, and we create a narrative around their comeback or retirement. In America, it seems you just matter less if you get hurt. Sure, they still celebrate injury comebacks, but Tiger Woods' comeback was only complete when he'd won the Masters. The achievement of just getting back to playing at the elite level was hardly celebrated. People were even calling for him to retire. It was only when he won that his comeback was given its full credence. Another example is in Germany, with the concept of precision. German football is known for its regular through balls, as midfielders try to precisely lay out the ball in the path of their attackers, and there's a notion that Germans don't lose on penalties. I could keep going, and I'm sure there's many layers of analysis beyond what I'm capable of, even beyond the level of nationality, right down to region or city. I'm sure there are cultural idiosyncrasies that are exhibited through sport all around the world. And through participating in that sport as a fan or a supporter, you're able to tap into some of that culture, even if you're not able to describe in tangible terms exactly what that is. So for me, the act of these owners trying to obliterate all of that and use these clubs, all of them over century-old institutions, as nothing but a money-making scheme should be criminalised. They would prefer to strip football of all of its cultural nuance and have franchise teams play in some Mickey Mouse league that wasn't worth anything except bragging rights and dollar bills. Sure, they've lost lots of money throughout the pandemic, but which sporting club hasn't? The Super League was first mooted in 1998, and they've been trying to make it happen ever since. To use the pandemic as an excuse to try and get it over the line, I think is ethically devoid. So what's the principle to take from all this? Firstly, notwithstanding that technically in a free market, these owners had a right to do this with their football teams, but what occurred afterwards, I think, was a pushback against the absolute commercialisation of sport. Previously, you could make the argument that sport was only heading in one direction, which was to be a more commercialised, dare I say Americanised model of sport. But the people in the UK particularly rose up against that and stopped it. I think this has huge implications for the direction of sport in the future. But the main thing that I want to touch on for the purposes of this podcast is a principle that I think these owners have ignored. And that's the fact that these clubs are all more than 100 years old, and they're institutions. No amount of money can undo the amount of history that came before the time in which these people owned the club. And I think it's important to recognise that. Like we've said on podcasts before, no one exists in a vacuum. And all of these clubs were only able to be in the position that they're in because of the 100 years plus history that came before these owners ever joined. Liverpool is a club that's won 6 European titles and 20 English First Division titles. Only one of those each have been under the current ownership of Fenway Sports Group. Manchester United was started in the 1880s by workers of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. They lived tough lives, and football gave them a sense of joy and belonging. It seems to me that the Glazer family have forgotten that and lost touch of what sport actually is. And I think in any situation that we're in, it's important to try and be grateful for those who've come before us and allowed us to be in the situation that we're in today. No matter who we are or what we do, we're standing on the shoulders of giants to be here. I'm a white guy living a happy life in Australia. There's a lot of personal sacrifice that I've benefited from that allowed that to happen. And I think if we don't have an awareness of that, it can draw us into feeling more entitled and pursuing more individualistic desires. Last year, for example, you could look at it on one hand and it sucked to be inside for so long. But how lucky were we to have access to all of the technology that we did and the medical supplies? Even now, people around the world are still in lockdown, most of them in much worse conditions than what we had. Yet there were still so many people complaining. To me, that flies in the face of all of the people who've really had to deal with unjust incarceration or pandemics at a time where there wasn't the medical knowledge to provide defence. If we can recognise how we benefit from the sacrifices others have made, it can help us to feel more grateful for the situation that we're in now. And that doesn't mean that we can't strive to improve things. I think we just have to be mindful. When we're looking to change something, there may be other people's perspectives that are really worth listening to before we decide to go in all guns blazing. It's not worth owning a football team if everyone's going to absolutely hate you for it, to the point where you can't even show up to games. So it's about being a bit more community-minded and collaborative with those who have an investment in something too, even if that investment is emotional. So that's all we've got time for today. I know it's been a bit of a different episode, but with the opportunity that came up, I've been pretty busting to talk some sport with you. And so thank you for indulging me. For those interested, I'll pop up a whole bunch of resources and videos that have interested me over the last couple of weeks at www.individuate.com.au. Thanks so much for spending some time with me today. I hope to do it again on the next episode of Individuate.